Hello, friend. Today I'm going to introduce you to 5 disturbing true stories that are hard to believe. Let's begin. The first story is a story related to the Lady Be Good. In 1943, the Lady Be Good was a US B-24 Liberator bomber stationed at the Soluch airstrip in Libya during World War II. The aircraft was manned by a crew of 9 young men, led by Lieutenant William Hatton. They were fresh recruits, and this was their very first combat mission together. On April 4th, the crew took off to bomb the harbour of Naples in Italy. After completing the drop, the formation turned back towards North Africa. It was late at night. Pitch black and a massive sandstorm was obscuring the ground below. By midnight, other planes had returned to the base, but the Lady Be Good was missing. The control tower tried to hail them on the radio, but received only static. Search and rescue teams scoured the coastline for days. Assuming the plane had crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, no wreckage was found. The Air Force declared the 9 men lost at sea, and the file was closed. Suddenly, in 1958, 15 years after the disappearance, a British oil survey team flying over the deep Libyan desert spotted a shape on the sand. It was a B-24 bomber sitting hundreds of miles inland, far away from where anyone had looked. A ground team drove out to investigate the wreckage. Looking at the plane, they saw something impossible. The Lady Be Good was almost perfectly intact. It had split in two upon impact. But it was not a catastrophic wreck. Inside, the machine guns were still oiled and functional. The radio was operational. There was even edible food and drinkable water in the survival kits. A thermos of tea was found still containing liquid. It looked as if the crew had just landed and walked away. However, there were no bodies inside the fuselage and no footprints in the surrounding sand. Investigators later pieced together the timeline. On that night in 1943, the pilot had flown right over the airbase in the dark, failing to see the runway lights through the sandstorm. Thinking they were still over the ocean and running out of fuel, the crew bailed out into the night. The unmanned plane, with its engines dead, glided down and landed itself on the soft sand of the Calancio Sand Sea. The 9 men landed safely with their parachutes. They found each other on the ground and began walking north, believing the Mediterranean coast was just a short distance away. In reality, they were 400 miles deep in the Sahara Desert. They had almost no water. For 8 days, they walked under the blistering sun. Search teams later found a trail of equipment, flight jackets, shoes, and flashlights that the men had dropped as they became too weak to carry them. They had marched nearly 100 miles before their bodies gave out. One by one, they collapsed and died of dehydration and heat stroke, lost in a sea of sand. The second story is the Khamar Daban incident. In 1993, Valentina was a young tourist from Kazakhstan joining a hiking expedition in southern Siberia. She was part of a group of 7 hikers, led by Lyudmila Korovina, a master guide with years of experience in survival. The group was fit, well prepared, and trekking through the Khamar Daban mountain range, a beautiful but rugged area near Lake Baikal. On August 4th, as the group descended from the Hanula Ridge, a severe rainstorm hit the mountain. Instead of descending further into the forest for shelter, Lyudmila decided to set up camp right on the exposed mountainside. The group spent a cold, miserable night in their tents without a fire. The next morning, August 5th, they packed their gear to continue the descent. That is when the chaos began. As they were preparing to leave, one of the male hikers, Alexander, suddenly started screaming. He fell to the ground, foaming at the mouth. Blood began to pour from his eyes and ears. He convulsed violently on the snow and then stopped moving. Lyudmila, the leader, ran over to help him. Almost immediately, she began to struggle for breath. She clutched her throat, vomited blood, and collapsed next to him. Panic swept through the remaining 5 members. One by one, they began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. A female hiker named Tatiana started tearing at her own clothes and bashing her head against a rock. Another member, Timur, tried to run but stumbled and began vomiting blood. Within minutes, 6 of the 7 hikers were rolling on the ground in agony, dying from an invisible force. Valentina, the only one not yet affected, stood frozen in horror. Realizing she could do nothing to save them, she grabbed a sleeping bag and some food, then ran down the mountain as fast as she could. She fled into the forest, terrified that whatever had killed her friends was coming for her. She survived alone in the wilderness for several days before finding a river, and eventually being rescued by a group of kayakers. When a search team finally reached the campsite later that month, they found a disturbing scene. The bodies of the 6 hikers were scattered across the slope. Some were partially undressed, despite the freezing cold. Their skin had turned a strange yellowish-orange color. The autopsy reports listed the official cause of death as hypothermia. citing the wet and cold conditions. However, hypothermia does not explain the bleeding from the eyes, the frothing at the mouth, or the sudden violent seizures. Theories have ranged from the accidental inhalation of Soviet nerve gas testing in the area to the consumption of toxic mushrooms, or even infrasound caused by the wind. To this day, the true cause of the violent deaths at Khamar Daban remains unknown, leaving Valentina as the sole witness to a massacre she cannot explain. The third story is a story related to Dorothea Puente. In the 1980s, Dorothea Puente was a 59-year-old woman living in Sacramento, California. She ran a boarding house in a Victorian-style home, renting rooms to the elderly, the homeless, and people with mental health issues. To the community, she was a sweet, charitable grandmother who cooked hot meals for those who had nowhere else to go. She was often seen tending to her flower garden in the backyard, wearing nice clothes and large glasses. In November 1988, a social worker became concerned about a tenant named Alvaro Montoya. Alvaro had a developmental disability and had been missing for several days. He had not shown up to his support meetings, which was unlike him. The social worker reported him missing, and Detective John Cabrera was sent to Dorothea's house to investigate. When Cabrera arrived, Dorothea welcomed him inside. She remained calm and cooperative, telling the detective that Alvaro had gone on a vacation to Mexico with a relative. However, while walking through the property, Cabrera noticed something strange in the backyard. The soil in the garden appeared to have been recently disturbed. When he asked Dorothea about it, she claimed she had been digging to dump sewer waste and to plant vegetables. Cabrera was not convinced. He returned with a shovel and began to probe the soil himself. As he dug into the soft earth, his shovel hit something hard. It felt like a tree root. He reached down to pull it out, but as he brushed away the dirt, he realized it was not wood, it was a human leg bone, still attached to a foot inside a shoe. Suddenly, the sweet grandmother facade crumbled, though Dorothea remained eerily composed. As the police began to uncover the remains, Dorothea approached the officers. She told them she had nothing to hide and asked for permission to go to a nearby hotel to buy a cup of coffee while they worked. Surprisingly, the police allowed her to leave. She immediately fled the city. Back at the house, the investigation turned into a massive excavation. Over the next few days, police unearthed a total of 7 bodies buried in the small backyard garden. The victims were all former tenants of the boarding house. The investigation revealed that Dorothea had been systematically murdering her boarders. She would drug them with sleeping pills, suffocate them, and then bury them in the yard. Her motive was purely financial. After killing them, she would forge their signatures and continue to cash their social security checks, stealing thousands of dollars a month. The kind old lady tending to her garden was actually standing over the graves of the people she was supposed to be caring for. Dorothea was eventually captured in Los Angeles, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, where she died in 2011. The fourth story is the Colorado cannibal case. In January 1874, a group of exhausted prospectors arrived at the camp of Chief Ore, leader of the Ute tribe in the Colorado Territory. They were seeking gold in the San Juan Mountains, but were ill-equipped for the brutal winter conditions. Seeing their desperate state, the chief offered them food and sanctuary. He explicitly warned the group that the mountain passes were a death trap during these months, and advised them to wait at his camp until spring arrived. Most of the men heeded this wisdom and chose to stay. However, a guide named Alfred Packer was driven by an intense greed. He convinced 5 other men that waiting months for spring was foolish and that they could beat the winter to reach the goldfields before anyone else. Ignoring the warning that the snow would swallow them, Packer and his 5 companions packed their supplies and marched into the wilderness. On February 9th, that was the last time the group was seen alive. Weeks turned into months, and a heavy silence fell over the mountains. To the outside world, the 6 men had simply vanished into the white abyss. There were no tracks, no smoke, and no messages. Then, on April 16th, Alfred Packer walked out of the woods and arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. He was alone. He told the agency staff a harrowing story of survival. He claimed that during a massive blizzard, his 5 companions had abandoned him. He said he had survived the last 2 months on nothing but roots, rosebuds, and occasional small game. At first, his story was met with sympathy, but as Packer sat down to rest, the men at the agency began to notice details that did not add up. A man who had been starving in the mountains for 60 days should have been emaciated, weak, and barely able to walk. Packer, however, was shockingly healthy. His face was full, his skin was rosy, and he showed no signs of the physical deterioration that comes with starvation. When offered a meal, he did not eat ravenously. Instead, he calmly requested a glass of whiskey. Suspicion quickly turned into a criminal investigation when Packer began spending large amounts of money at the agency's store. Witnesses observed him pulling cash from several different wallets that clearly did not belong to him. That August, as the snow finally melted, a search party led by a sketch artist for Harper's Weekly located the group's campsite at the foot of Slumgullion Pass. The scene they discovered was not a tragedy of nature, but a crime scene. The 5 missing men were found lying in a clearing. They had not frozen to death. The forensic evidence showed they had been murdered in their sleep. Their skulls had been crushed by a blunt object, consistent with a hatchet found nearby. But the most disturbing detail was the condition of the bodies. Large strips of flesh had been methodically sliced off their thighs and chests with a knife. The chest cavities had been cracked open and internal organs were missing. Confronted with the physical evidence, Packer's defense crumbled. He eventually confessed that he had lived off the bodies of his companions. For nearly 2 months he had camped there, boiling their flesh to survive the winter until the weather cleared. He was convicted of murder and remains in history as the Colorado cannibal. The 5th story is the Hinterkaifeck murders. In 1922, Andreas Gruber was a 63-year-old farmer living with his family at Hinterkaifeck, a small isolated farmstead located about 40 miles north of Munich, Germany. The household consisted of Andreas, his wife Casilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Casilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The farm was surrounded by dense woods, far removed from the nearest village. A few days before the incident, Andreas noticed something unsettling in the snow. He found a set of fresh footprints emerging from the forest and leading directly to the farm. He followed the tracks, expecting to see them loop back or head towards a neighbor's property. However, the footprints stopped at the machine house. There were no return tracks leading back into the woods. Someone had walked onto the property and had not left. Around this time, the family also began hearing strange footsteps in the attic at night and realized a set of house keys had gone missing. On March 31st, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm for her first day of work. That evening, the entire family vanished from public view. Days passed, the postman noticed the mail piling up. Neighbors saw no one working in the fields. On April 4th, concerned by the silence, a search party, led by a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, decided to investigate the property. Entering the barn, Lorenz witnessed a scene of absolute carnage. Buried under a pile of hay were 4 bodies: Andreas, his wife, his daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old granddaughter. Their skulls had been shattered. The weapon, a mattock, was found nearby. Moving into the farmhouse, the searchers found the new maid Maria, dead in her bedroom. She had been killed on her very first night. In the master bedroom, they found the 2-year-old baby, Joseph, dead in his crib. He had been struck with the same heavy tool while he slept. However, the autopsy revealed a detail that made this crime horrific beyond simple murder. The medical examiner determined that the family had been killed on the evening of March 31st, but the bodies were not discovered until April 4th. During those 4 days between the murders and the discovery, neighbors had reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney. When police examined the scene, they found that the cattle in the barn had been recently fed. There was bread and meat in the pantry that had been eaten recently. This evidence led to a chilling conclusion. The killer did not flee immediately after slaughtering the 6 people. He stayed in the house. For days, he lived among the corpses. He cooked meals in the kitchen, slept in the beds, and tended to the animals, all while the bodies of the family lay stacking in the barn and the bedrooms. He eventually slipped away into the forest, leaving no trace behind. To this day, the identity of the person who lived with the dead at Hinterkaifeck remains a mystery. Okay, those are the 5 disturbing true stories that are hard to believe. Note that this info is compiled from multiple sources, so minor errors may occur. If these stories gave you chills, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. Let me know in the comments. Bye for now.